Sealed and Forgotten, a journalistic exposé on the cult of isolation. In the ever-expanding landscape of obscure subcultures and underground movements, few manage to evade public scrutiny entirely. Yet one group, quietly operating since 1968, has remained shrouded in mystery and speculation. Known as the Order of Derelictum, the organization functions more as a philosophical enclave than a religious sect, rejecting supernatural beliefs in favor of a deeply rooted ideology of isolation and self-reliance. At its core, it preaches that solitude is the ultimate liberation, a stark contrast to a society increasingly obsessed with validation and connection. When I first heard of the order, I was skeptical. How could a group so seemingly benign, with no history of violence or coercion, persist for over 50 years in near total anonymity? With approximately 40 members ranging in age from their early 20s to their mid-70s, the group's existence feels anachronistic in the digital age. Yet their carefully cultivated secrecy and the unnerving rumors surrounding their annual ritual compelled me to dig deeper. The Order of Derelictum was founded in 1968 by Everett March, a reclusive academic and self-proclaimed misanthrope. March, then a professor of philosophy at a small college in rural Pennsylvania, published a controversial paper titled The Virtue of Isolation, a critique of communal dependency. The paper argued that human connection was inherently corrosive, fostering betrayal, disappointment, and stagnation. While widely dismissed in academic circles as the ramblings of a bitter man, the paper resonated with a small but devoted following of students and colleagues. March's teachings evolved into an informal gathering which later became the Order of Derelictum. The group's name, derived from the Latin word derelictum, meaning abandoned or forsaken, reflected its central tenet: the belief that true strength and enlightenment can only be achieved through severing all attachments, physical, emotional, and social. By the early 1970s, the group had grown modestly, attracting disillusioned individuals who saw themselves as victims of a society that valued conformity over individuality. Members shared stories of rejection, heartbreak, and alienation, finding solace in the order's embrace of solitude. Over time, their gatherings became less about communal support and more about celebrating the virtue of isolation itself. By 1973. Everett March had gone into total self-reclusion, abandoning the movement and disappearing from the world completely. When looking into the order's teachings, it's easy to see that they are paradoxical, often bordering on ironic. Members insist they are not a religious group, dismissing the supernatural as a distraction from the human condition. Yet, they personify their ideology through a fictional entity known as Derelictum, the supposed embodiment of isolation and abandonment. To the order, Derelictum is not a god or deity, but a metaphor for the ultimate state of being, detached, self-reliant, and free. This atheistic symbolism extends to their practices, which the order describes as satirical imitations of traditional religious rites. Chief among these is their annual ritual of voluntary sealing, held each winter solstice. The event involves ceremonially leading a chosen member to a small room where they are sealed inside, the act being meant to symbolize the embrace of ultimate solitude. While members insist the ritual is purely symbolic, whispers of something more sinister have lingered for decades. Today, the order operates out of scattered locations across the United States, with no central headquarters or formal recruitment process. Its membership remains small, never exceeding 50 at any given time, and consists of individuals from all walks of life. Some are young adults disillusioned by the superficiality of modern culture, while others are older, hardened by decades of loneliness and loss. Despite their doctrine of isolation, the order maintains a surprising sense of camaraderie among its members. Outsiders are rarely invited to witness their gatherings, and those who leave the group seldom speak of their experiences. This silence, coupled with the lack of public incidents, has allowed the order to operate without interference from law enforcement or watchdog organizations. When I first approached the Order of Derelictum with a request to observe their practices, I anticipated reluctance, perhaps outright refusal. Instead, they were remarkably accommodating. After weeks of negotiation, I was invited to witness their preparations for the ritual of voluntary sealing, a pivotal event in their calendar and the cornerstone of their philosophy. My guide into their world was Mara, an enigmatic woman in her 50s with a calm demeanor that bordered on off-putting. She assured me the order had nothing to hide. "We're just people who've realized that loneliness isn't something to fear," she said during our initial phone call. And so, armed with a journalist's skepticism and a notebook, I made my way to the remote farmhouse where the order gathered. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I approached the door, my breath visible in the freezing air. I half expected shadowy figures peering through lace curtains, but the door opened almost immediately. I was greeted with warm smiles and an air of disarming calm. What followed was a day that would challenge my understanding of isolation, community, and the fragility of human memory. The farmhouse itself was stark but welcoming, a relic of a simpler time. The hum of modernity, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the ping of notifications was absent. Instead, the soft crackle of a wood-burning stove and the muted murmur of conversations filled the air. Members moved with purpose and precision, exuding a quiet serenity that seemed at odds with their rejection of human bonds. After a brief introduction, Mara led me to the main gathering area. The room was simple, furnished with mismatched chairs, a cluttered bookshelf, and a large fireplace that filled the space with warmth. Above the mantel hung framed excerpts from The Virtue of Isolation, the Order's philosophical manifesto. One passage caught my eye. "To embrace isolation is to embrace clarity. The absence of others does not leave you empty, it leaves you whole to yourself." The members themselves were as diverse as they were reserved. Some were in their 20s, others old enough to be grandparents. They spent the morning engaged in solitary activities, journaling, reading, knitting. Words were exchanged sparingly and in soft tones, as though the act of speaking itself was an intrusion. Despite their individual pursuits, a quiet camaraderie lingered in the air. "They're not what you expected, are they?" Mara asked, catching my expression as I observed them. I admitted they weren't. The stereotype of a cult, zealous and domineering, didn't seem to apply here. These people were neither fanatical nor hostile. They didn't try to convert me or extol the virtues of their way of life. Instead, they seemed mildly amused by my presence, as though they'd seen countless others try to understand their world and fail. "We're not fanatics," Mara said. "We're people who found a better way to live." As the day unfolded, I spoke with several members. Adrian, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, recounted the bitter divorce that had brought him to the order. Therapy didn't help. Support groups didn't help. "Being here, it's like turning off a noisy radio," he explained. Mara, too, shared her story. A lifetime of strained relationships and an overwhelming sense of alienation had led her to derelictum. "I realized I was lonelier surrounded by people than I ever could be alone," she said. "The order didn't save me. It gave me permission to let go." Not everyone was as forthcoming. Some offered curt responses or avoided conversation altogether. Yet, there was no hostility, only a guardedness that hinted at wounds too deep to discuss with a stranger. Later, Mara continued the tour of the farmhouse. She pointed out small rooms furnished with only the essentials: a bed, a chair, a desk. "Simplicity breeds clarity," she said. In the dimly lit library, she showed me shelves of journals penned by members past and present. "This is how we confront ourselves," she explained, "without the noise of others speaking for us, over us, and through us." The day ended with a communal meal, another apparent contradiction to their doctrine of isolation. Plates of simple, home-cooked food were passed around as the group ate in near silence. Despite the minimal conversation, there was a palpable sense of solidarity. As the meal concluded, Mara leaned over and whispered, "Tonight, you'll see what we mean when we say isolation isn't just absence. It's an escape." Her words lingered as the group began preparing for the ritual. The calm that had defined the day now felt heavy. Something was coming, and though I didn't yet know what, I could feel its weight pressing down on me. Once, the sun fully dipped below the horizon, the farmhouse grew impossibly still. Members of the order gathered in the main room, where a single candle flickered on a low wooden table. The air was heavy, not with dread, but with a quiet reverence. This was the night of their annual ritual of voluntary sealing, a ceremony they regarded as the purest expression of their philosophy. The ritual is entirely voluntary, Mara had explained earlier in the day. Anyone who feels ready to embrace total solitude may step forward. It's not about having an obligation, it's about making the choice. The notion seemed absurd to me. Despite their calm demeanor, I couldn't imagine anyone willingly entombing themselves in the tiny room I had seen in the basement. The space was stark, its concrete walls unforgiving, but it was meticulously prepared. A cot with a thin mattress, stacks of canned goods, bottles of water, a few personal items. Books and journals lined a small shelf. "This is not punishment," Mara reiterated, as we stood in the dimly lit hallway leading to the room. "It's liberation, a chance to truly face oneself and let go of everything." By the time the ceremony began, I had assumed my place among the members, a silent observer to their most sacred tradition. The group formed a loose circle around the candle, their faces solemn but serene. The evening commenced with readings from The Virtue of Isolation, each member reciting a passage that spoke to their belief in the power of isolation. Excerpts from The Virtue of Isolation. To embrace isolation is to strip away the noise of others and finally hear the rhythm of your own soul. The world teaches us that connection is salvation, but in truth, connection is the shackle and solitude the key. Betrayal, heartbreak, and disappointment, these are not inflicted by solitude. They are gifts from connection. To walk alone is to walk free from the wounds of others. The lie of companionship is a seductive one. It whispers promises of warmth and belonging, yet leaves behind only the cold ashes of disillusionment. Wise turn away from the fire and find comfort in their own shadow. The world demands connection, rewards it, glorifies it, but ask yourself, at what cost? What part of you must die to keep others alive in your presence? As the recitations concluded, Mara stepped forward to address the group. Her voice was steady, carrying an almost maternal warmth. "Tonight," she said, "we honor the ideals of self-reliance and solitude. If anyone feels called to embrace the path of clarity, you may step forward." The room fell silent. My pen hovered over my notebook as I waited to see what would happen. The order had assured me that the ritual was symbolic, that no one ever truly volunteered. I was skeptical, but as the seconds stretched into minutes, it seemed Mara's words might pass unanswered. Then something strange happened. My memory of the events becomes hazy here, as though someone had erased the details before I could record them. I recall a low murmur spreading through the group, voices speaking words I couldn't quite catch. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the flickering candlelight. I remember the soft scrape of a chair against the wooden floor, the sensation of movement, and then nothing. When my awareness returned, the ritual was over. The candle had been extinguished, and the group was dispersing, their faces calm and untroubled. Mara approached me with a smile. "And so we carry on," she said softly. I glanced around the room, searching for something, or someone, I couldn't quite place. "Did anyone volunteer?" I asked, my voice faltering. Mara tilted her head, her expression one of mild confusion. "No one ever does," she replied. "That's not the point." I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. My notes contained nothing about a volunteer, but the memory of movement, the scrape of the chair, the murmur of voices, lingered uneasily in my mind. Later that night, I crept down to the basement, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The room was sealed, its door now hidden behind a freshly laid wall of bricks. The concrete was still damp, the faint smell of mortar hanging in the air. I stood there for a long time, staring at the wall. The ritual was supposed to be symbolic, yet the sealed room felt disturbingly real. I pressed my palm against the cold surface, half expecting to feel movement from the other side. But there was only silence, a silence that felt far too complete. Back upstairs, I found Mara tidying. The main room. "Doesn't something feel final?" I asked her, unsure how else to phrase the knot of unease in my chest. Mara paused, considering my words. "Finality is an illusion," she said. "In isolation, there is no end." Her answer offered no comfort. As I lay awake that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something far darker than the group intended to reveal. I left the farmhouse the morning after the ritual with a lingering sense of unease. The order of derelictums. Members, ever polite, bid me farewell with serene smiles, as if the previous night's events were nothing extraordinary. Mara, my guide throughout the experience, thanked me for my curiosity. "We hope you've seen that solitude isn't something to run from," she said, as she handed me a neatly organized folder containing records of their previous rituals. Her words were meant to be reassuring, but they only deepened my discomfort. The sealed room in the basement, its door hidden behind a fresh wall of bricks, haunted my thoughts. Though the ritual was described as symbolic, I still couldn't forget that soft scrape of a chair, the murmurs of the group, or the chilling sensation that something had been deliberately erased from my memory. The folder Mara provided contained a list of previous ritual sites, each marked with precise dates and locations. The Order's annual ceremonies spanned decades, with entries as far back as the 1970s. These records were my next step. I intended to investigate the abandoned locations to uncover the truth behind the ritual and the unsettling possibility that someone might have actually been sealed inside. The first site I visited was, of course, a derelict barn in rural Minnesota. Fresh snow blanketed the landscape, muffling the crunch of my boots as I approached the structure. Inside, I found little to suggest the barn's connection to the Order, just rusted tools and piles of decayed wood. But when I located the far corner of the building, where the records indicated the ritual had taken place, my breath caught. Behind a section of crumbling plaster, I discovered a small, sealed compartment. The bricks were discolored, and the mortar had long since deteriorated. With the help of a crowbar, I carefully dismantled the wall. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Inside the sealed space were human remains, bones arranged in a haphazard pile, as though the person had collapsed and been left abandoned. My stomach churned as I noted the worn remnants of clothing, a rusted tin cup, and the spine of a book, its pages reduced to brittle fragments. I reported my discovery to the local authorities, who quickly arrived to secure the scene. The forensic team's findings were baffling. The remains bore no identifying features, no DNA matches, no dental records, nothing that could link them to any known individual. It was as if the person had been erased from existence. This pattern repeated at the next two sites. In an abandoned warehouse in Indiana, I found another walled-in space containing bones and decayed belongings. At an old farmhouse in Ohio, the same grim evidence awaited. Each time the authorities were called, and each time the forensic reports came back with the same chilling conclusion. The victims could not be identified. The more sites I investigated, the heavier the burden of discovery became. The sealed spaces told stories of profound isolation and suffering, stories that had been silenced, their authors erased. The people who had willingly entered these rooms, whether out of faith or desperation, seemed to have been consumed not only by solitude but by something far more sinister. The question of why haunted me. Why would someone volunteer for such a fate? And why were their identities so thoroughly erased? The Order, for its part, denied any wrongdoing. When I contacted Mara to share my findings, she expressed genuine surprise. "Our rituals are symbolic," she insisted. "No one has ever been sealed inside. I don't know what you think you found, but it's not connected to us." Her tone was sincere, but I couldn't ignore the evidence. The locations matched their records perfectly. The remains, though nameless, bore witness to something the Order either refused to acknowledge or could not remember. My growing suspicion was that the cult was not lying. They truly believed their rituals were symbolic. But the sheer consistency of the evidence suggested an unseen force at work, something beyond human comprehension. The order of derelictum had become a vessel for something they neither controlled nor understood. By the time I reached the final site in my investigation, a sense of dread had taken hold of me. The ritual was not symbolic. It was a tragedy repeated year after year, leaving behind a trail of lives abandoned and forgotten. As I prepared to visit the farmhouse where I had attended the ritual, questions swirled in my mind. What had I truly witnessed that night? Who or what was responsible for the erasure of these lives? The weight of the truth pressed heavily on my chest as I drove toward that snow-covered house. I knew I wasn't just chasing a story anymore. I was chasing ghosts. Returning to the farmhouse where I had witnessed the ritual was like stepping back into a half-remembered nightmare. Snow blanketed the property, muffling sound and motion, giving the scene an eerie stillness. This time, I wasn't alone. A team of law enforcement officers accompanied me, their skepticism thinly veiled as they prepared to investigate the sealed room in the basement. The farmhouse had been abandoned in the week since my first visit. The warmth and quiet solidarity I had witnessed during my initial stay were now replaced by a suffocating silence. The building felt devoid of life, though faint traces of the order's presence lingered. The faint smell of wood smoke, an overturned chair, a forgotten scarf draped over a bench. The officers and I descended into the basement, the beam of my flashlight trembling against the cold, gray walls. The sealed room stood exactly as I remembered it, its entrance hidden behind a freshly constructed brick wall. Despite its mundane appearance, the sight of it made my stomach churn. I had seen too many sights like this, each one a grave disguised as a symbol. Using sledgehammers and crowbars, the officers began dismantling the wall. The sound of bricks falling to the ground echoed through the basement, each impact sending a jolt through my body. When the opening was finally cleared, a wave of stale, oppressive air rushed out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. Inside, we found him. A man, barely alive, lay curled in the corner of the tiny room. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his frame was skeletal, as though he had been wasting away for weeks. He blinked slowly against the light, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Around him were the remnants of the room's provisions, empty water bottles, cans, and a journal filled with disjointed, frantic scrawls. The officers pulled him out, and paramedics rushed him to the surface. As they worked, I stood frozen, staring at the space he had occupied. On the walls, he had etched symbols and phrases with whatever tools he could find. Most were incomprehensible, but a single word repeated over and over stood out: forgotten. At the hospital, I was permitted to interview the man briefly. His name, he said, was unknown. In addition, there weren't any records to confirm his identity. He spoke as though he was lost in some forlorn place. His voice was weak, barely a whisper, but his words were cutting. "They chose me," he said, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond the sterile walls of the room. I stepped forward. It felt like the right thing, like clarity. But once the wall closed, I felt it. The abandonment. It started so quickly. When I pressed him on what he meant by the abandonment, he hesitated, as though he struggled to recall. "It's like I never existed," he murmured. "Not just to the world, but to myself. Memories, names, everything fades. You don't even remember why you volunteered." The man's account aligned disturbingly with my own experiences. The members of the order, and even I, had no memory of anyone stepping forward during the ritual. The erasure he described seemed to extend beyond the individual, affecting everyone who had ever known them. More horrifying still was the realization that the man's survival was an anomaly. At the other sites I had investigated, no one had been found alive. I couldn't shake the thought that his rescue had interrupted whatever process was at work, leaving him caught in an existential limbo, a man erased from the world, yet still, clinging to its edges. Law enforcement's attempts to identify him proved futile. His fingerprints matched no database, and his DNA yielded no familial connections. Even the journal he had written in the sealed room contained nothing useful, just fragmented thoughts and desperate, cryptic pleas. I returned to the farmhouse one last time to reflect on what we had uncovered. Standing in the basement, staring at the now empty room, I felt a profound sense of dread. The Order's rituals were not symbolic gestures. They were something far darker, a mechanism for erasure, a means of offering people to a force that thrived on abandonment and oblivion. The Order of Derelictum, for all its intellectual posturing and philosophical ideals, had unwittingly become a conduit for something beyond their understanding. Their insistence that no one ever entered the sealed rooms wasn't a lie. It was a symptom of the abandonment, a consequence of whatever malevolent influence had entwined itself with their practices. As I left the farmhouse, snow falling softly around me, I felt the weight of what I had uncovered settle on my shoulders. The man we had found, the bones in the walls, the erasure of their identities, all of it pointed to a truth I was not prepared to confront. This was no longer just a story. It was a glimpse into the abyss of human isolation, where even memory could be stripped away. I don't know what derelictum is, but I know that it will give its followers exactly what they want: absolute abandonment. If you're interested in any of the other cults I've interviewed, I've got plenty more to share. For now, let me leave you with a final excerpt from Everett March's work. To seek derelictum is to seek the ultimate solitude, a state in which even the self dissolves into nothingness. Derelictum does not offer salvation, for salvation is a connection. It does not offer purpose, for purpose is an anchor. It offers only abandonment, pure and absolute. Followers must understand that derelictum is not a deity to be worshipped, nor a force to be feared. It is the embodiment of isolation, an apathy so profound that it forgets even those who revere it. In its perfect solitude, derelictum neither acknowledges nor remembers its followers. Those who choose to walk its path do so not for recognition, but for the shedding of all ties, including the tie to derelictum itself. To be truly abandoned is to be erased, not punished, not rewarded, but simply removed. In the quiet oblivion of erasure, one finds clarity. The final gift of derelictum is indifference, for even its gaze is a connection too binding for those who seek it. Derelictum does not seek worship. It seeks isolation. Its apathy is infinite, a void that consumes even the memory of those who approach it. To follow is to embrace this void, to surrender not only the bonds of the world, but the bond to existence itself. And in that surrender, one becomes nothing, and in becoming nothing, one is finally untethered. Everett March, The Virtue of Isolation, a critique of communal dependency.